Welcome back. This is Mr. Hyatt on the Chapter 54 AP Biology lecture. I left off talking about mutualistic relationships between ants and the acacia tree. This is something that we saw firsthand in Belize over spring break. These ants live on some plants. They live inside needles, so the plant provides a home, and the ants provide defense mechanisms. Specific to Belize, it was a fire ant that provided the defense mechanism, and the tree provided a home. There's a video in the lecture about clownfish and the anemone. We know about that from Finding Nemo. So they definitely both interact and they both benefit from that interaction. So commensalism is an example where one species benefits and the other is not helped nor harmed. So it's basically unaffected. Some of these are wildflowers. See, shade-tolerant flowers depend upon the bigger trees, and the big trees aren't affected by the wildflowers. Another example is the shark and the remora, the little fish that swim around near the shark. They don't clean it, they're not attached to it or anything like that. They just dart out and pick up the scraps when sharks eat and make a big mess. Other examples are cattle egrets, and so you see a picture of that right there. The egrets are benefiting from the insects that the bison kind of knock up and kick up, but they don't really affect the bison. So sometimes they may pick at dead things and pick at bacteria and things like that are on the cow. So in that case, it would skew mutualistic, but the base relationship is commensalistic. Not a lot of those examples found in nature. So 54.2 is going to talk about trophic structure, so relative amounts of producers and consumers and things like that, and then species diversity. Two important terms for us to know and be able to separate or differentiate are species richness and species abundance. Species richness is the number of different species, so we might call that diversity. And then relative abundance or species abundance is going to be the relative amount of each species in the community. So two communities could have the same species richness, have the same number of different organisms, but different relative abundances. So here, you've got two communities that have tree A, B, C, and D. We still have the same four trees down here. If you look, there's A, there's B, there's C, and there's D. They all four have the same species richness, but they have different relative abundances. So when you're talking about diversity, sometimes you got to put a number to that. That number is called the Shannon Diversity Index. And so you're saying frequency of A, frequency of B, frequency of C, and so on. Ln is natural log. That's a button on your calculator, basically. So if we do this calculation for those two communities that we saw in this slide, we see that community 1 has a much higher index, so we would say it has much more diversity. Now don't stress about that calculation. I'm not going to ask you to do that calculation on the exam. So sometimes, if it's a tree, it's easy to count. If it's a bird, sometimes it's difficult to count. Sometimes we're limited by where the nest is. The nest near the road or near the path that we walk, or is it out in the middle of nowhere? A couple of terms that we've used throughout the course of this unit already are biomass. So communities with higher diversity are more productive. So they have more biomass because they have larger diversity. They're more stable in their productivity. Always higher diversity equals more stability. Better able to withstand and recover from environmental stresses, so they're more resilient. And they're more resistant to invasive species because, again, they have a lot of diversity. Trophic structure is kind of a fancy way of saying food chains, food webs, things like that. Remember that each step in the food chain is called a trophic level. We've got a couple of different names, a couple of different synonyms here. We've got primary producers that are plants that are photosynthesizers. We've got primary consumers that are herbivores because they eat producers. Secondary consumers are going to be carnivores because they eat primary consumers. Tertiaries are going to be carnivores. Quaternaries are going to be carnivores, again because they all eat the trophic level below them. Got a terrestrial example and a marine example. There's a video of a shark eating a seal that kind of demonstrates part of the food chain. Food web, of course, is going to be a bunch of chains interacted or interconnected. Not interacted, sorry about that. But notice that a species can play more than one role and be in more than one trophic level in a food web. So often we'll isolate portions of a community in a food chain to study small interactions, and then we'll group larger trophic levels to study broad functional relationships. But it can be difficult to get a lot of meaning out of something this messy. Something like this we can get some meaning out of. We can see relative food relationships and things along those lines. There are a few limits on how long a food chain can be. Each food chain is typically only a few links long, because only about 10% of the energy is passed up to each level. We looked at that in our ecological pyramids. At each step, 90% of the available energy is lost to heat and lost to absorption. You're using that energy. It's not just available to you. So that energetic hypothesis can be tested by doing a couple of different things. We can vary leaf litter to consumers in treehole communities and measure the number of links in the food chain. So leaf litter would be like the amount of dead leaves that have fallen. So you see the natural rate, we have long food chains. If we have low litter, not a lot of leaves, dead leaves, we get short food chains. Another thing that limits food chain length is that carnivores are larger, and they're larger when they're at higher trophic levels. So like we said, pyramid of energy shows us why sharks are always eating. Pyramid of numbers, pyramid of biomass shows why there aren't a ton of sharks. There are some sorry, I skipped a slide here. There are certain species that have a large impact on the community structure. Remember, community is all the populations in the same place at the same time. Some of those are called dominant species because they are the most abundant or have the highest biomass. Think about that tree community we saw there. One hypothesis suggests that the dominant species gets the most out of resources, so maybe they grow the fastest in that ecosystem, so they take over and become the dominant species. Another hypothesis is that they're just better at surviving, so they avoid predators and disease. Either way, you're talking about two different ways to become the most prominent species in ecosystem. Invasive species can quickly become dominant because they lack natural predators, so they can take over a food web really quickly. An example of discovering the impact of a dominant species is the North American chestnut tree. When they went away, some species changed drastically, some didn't change much at all. So it was there's a case study of that in your book. That's a good example of a dominant species affecting others. Another large impact species is the Keystone species, because they're going to have a broad niche that has a really big role in the food web. Last slide referenced the sea stars. You see that we're talking about the number of species present over here. Without the sea star, the total number of species diminished. When the sea star was added, total number of species increased. So that's a great example of a keystone species. Without this starfish, the food chain and the ecosystem as a whole is really developed. Ecosystem engineers are often called foundation species. That's an old school term, foundation species. They cause changes in the environmental structure. So things like beavers building dams and elephants clearing grasslands and things along those lines. Kind of transition a little bit here, looking at two different ways to look at community organization. So this is kind of a science, artificial way of looking at the ecosystem, not necessarily innate to the ecosystem, if that makes sense. So bottom-up model basically says that nutrients controls plants, which control herbivores, which control predators. So the thing that dictates how many predators you can have is the amount of nutrients. So if you add a bunch of fertilizer to the soil, you'll get more plants, you'll get more herbivores, and you'll get more predators. You just kind of follow the food chain. The top-down model says the opposite is true. If you take away predators, you get more of these, you get more of these, and you get more of this. Or if you increase predators, you get fewer and fewer and fewer of these. Both are true, just different ways to look at the community. So where this becomes helpful is when we get messed up communities. In Finland, there's a lake where blooms of cyanobacteria happened when zooplankton were eaten by this type of fish, this roach fish. If you get rid of the roach fish and add pike perch, which are tertiary consumers, kind of replace this, that controlled the roach population. So getting rid of some of the secondaries and introducing a predator controlled the roach populations, which allowed zooplankton to come back and allowed the rest of the food chain to be fixed, basically. That's kind of what you're seeing here. So you want the zooplankton, the producers, and the algae that's a producer, you want those to be really abundant if you can. And so I think that probably makes sense. Moving on to 54.3, disturbances. So decades ago, like in the 80s, people looked at the communities as if they were pretty much in a state of equilibrium. They weren't changing drastically. We weren't in an ice age. We weren't in a really fast warming trend. Well, pretty soon we saw that these were beginning to change. Conditions were changing. And as conditions changed, the idea that we were at equilibrium became less palatable, I guess. So you see Tansley argued that variation in abiotic conditions created many stable communities within a region. So variation within temperature, humidity, rainfall, those types of things can create many possible stable communities. Whether we're at that stable landmark or not, he didn't say. So a disturbance is what it sounds like. Something that messes with an ecosystem. Maybe it's a forest fire, maybe it's a flood, maybe it's climate change, maybe it's a drought. Anything that messes with an ecosystem, particularly if it removes organisms. And we see now we kind of operate under this non-equilibrium model where communities are constantly changing after some sort of a disturbance. I kind of listed some of those while looking at the last slide. Intermediate disturbance hypothesis basically says moderate levels of disturbance can foster greater diversity than either low or high levels of disturbance. Think about if the ecosystem is constantly changing in small ways, you can accommodate a large diversity of adaptations. If it's constantly changing in small ways, there are a lot of ways to be different and still take advantage of the conditions. High levels of disturbance are going to exclude slow-growing species because if you've got a major flood every year, some of those slow-growing species are never going to be able to establish themselves. And then low levels of disturbance are going to allow large dominant species to take over less competitive and less maybe slower growing species again, or faster growing species. Sorry about that. There are a couple of case studies. New Zealand study is a good one with invertebrates. And then Yellowstone, we saw communities respond rapidly to a massive disturbance. It's an example of a non-equilibrium community. Shortly after the fire, we saw things that looked like this. 1 year later, still have the dead pines, but we've got pretty diverse ground cover. Quickly, ecological succession we've looked at. Primary succession is how life establishes itself where no soil exists. Remember, soil is dirt plus nutrients. Think about Matt Damon in the movie The Martian here when you think about primary succession. I will pick up with the process of succession in video 3.